It was a bitterly cold night on a desolate stretch of highway in the Midwest. The kind of road where the hum of tires against the pavement is the only sound, and the headlights seem swallowed by an endless void. For Amanda, a 23-year-old college student, the trip was supposed to be a simple one. Drive back home for the holidays, her car loaded with gifts and luggage. She hadn't anticipated the snowstorm or her engine light flickering to life just as she passed a sign reading, "Next services, 50 miles." She muttered curses under her breath as the car sputtered to a halt. The temperature had plummeted to single digits, and her phone had no signal. After futile attempts to restart the car, she realized she was utterly alone. The dark pressed in from all sides, her breath clouding the windshield as she sat in the driver's seat, weighing her options. That's when she saw the headlights. They grew larger in her rearview mirror, accompanied by the deep rumble of a truck engine. A semi slowed as it neared her car, pulling off onto the shoulder with a screech of its brakes. Its hulking shape loomed like a metal behemoth against the night, its orange and red marker lights blinking ominously. Amanda hesitated. Her parents had always warned her about hitchhiking or accepting help from strangers, especially out here in the middle of nowhere. But as the trucker's door opened and he climbed out, waving a flashlight toward her car, desperation overrode caution. The man was tall, burly, with a thick salt and pepper beard. His flannel shirt was barely enough for the freezing air, but he didn't seem to mind. "Car trouble?" he called, his voice muffled by the wind. She nodded, cracking her door open to respond. "Won't start. I think it's the engine." The trucker nodded and approached, his boots crunching in the snow. He leaned into the hood, fiddling with the battery cables. After a moment, he straightened up. "Looks like you're not going anywhere tonight. Storm's getting worse. You'll freeze out here." Amanda hesitated, her instincts screaming at her. "I'll wait for another car to pass," she said, feigning confidence. "Suit yourself," the man replied with a shrug, stepping back. Then he added, almost as an afterthought, "Not many cars come through here at this hour, probably no one till morning." The words sent a shiver through her, colder than the air itself. She glanced at her car's dashboard. No heat, no power. The temperature inside the vehicle was already dropping fast. "All right," she said reluctantly, grabbing her coat and locking her car behind her. "Thank you." The truck's cab was warm, a sharp contrast to the bitter cold outside. The man gestured for her to climb into the passenger seat. Inside, it smelled faintly of coffee and diesel. Amanda couldn't help but notice the clutter, empty soda cans, crumpled fast food wrappers, and an odd assortment of items scattered across the dashboard. A tattered notebook sat on the console, its edges frayed as though it had been thumbed through countless times. As they pulled back onto the highway, the trucker introduced himself as Ron. He seemed friendly enough, asking about her trip, her family, her plans for Christmas. Still, something about his questions felt pointed, prying. Amanda gave short, polite answers, keeping her guard up. After a while, silence fell, broken only by the hum of the engine and the occasional hiss of the CB radio. Amanda noticed the notebook again. It was open now, lying face up, revealing a page filled with cramped, messy handwriting. At first, she didn't think much of it, until she caught a word: victim. Her pulse quickened as she scanned more of the writing. Phrases jumped out at her. Blonde, mid-20s, alone at night. Her stomach churned. That described her perfectly. "Everything all right?" Ron's voice startled her, and she quickly looked away from the notebook. "Yeah," she said, forcing a smile. "Just tired." Ron's eyes lingered on her for a moment too long before returning to the road. Amanda's heart raced as she tried to piece together an escape plan. The highway stretched endlessly ahead, and the snowstorm had thickened, reducing visibility to almost nothing. She considered her options. Jumping from a moving truck was suicide in these conditions. Ron's CB radio crackled to life, cutting through the tension. "Breaker, breaker. Got a live one?" The voice on the other end was coarse, almost playful. Amanda's blood ran cold. Ron reached for the microphone, his eyes never leaving the road. 10-4, he replied. "Picked her up about 10 miles back. Storm's working in our favor." Amanda froze. She didn't need to know CB lingo to understand the sinister undertone in his words. Her mind raced. How many were out there? Was this a network of predators? Ron's hand drifted toward the glove compartment. Amanda's breath caught as he opened it, revealing a hunting knife glinting in the dim light. "What's that for?" she asked, trying to keep her voice steady. Sometimes you run into trouble out here, he said casually. Wild animals, you know. The truck slowed, pulling onto an unmarked dirt road. Panic surged through Amanda as she realized they were leaving the highway. Where are we going? She demanded. Shortcut, Ron replied, his tone devoid of warmth. Don't worry, I'll get you where you need to go. Amanda knew she had to act fast. As Ron focused on navigating the snow-covered path, she reached for the door handle, praying it wasn't locked. To her relief, it clicked open. Without a second thought, she threw herself from the cab, hitting the ground hard. Pain shot through her arm, but adrenaline drowned it out. She scrambled to her feet and ran, the snow blinding and suffocating her. Behind her, the truck screeched to a halt. She heard Ron shouting, followed by the crunch of boots in the snow. Amanda ran until her lungs burned, the icy air slicing through her throat. The sound of pursuit grew louder. She tripped over a tree root and tumbled into the snow, gasping. Before she could rise, Ron loomed over her, his silhouette a monstrous shadow against the swirling storm. But then, headlights pierced the darkness. Another truck rumbled down the dirt road, its horn blaring. Ron froze, cursing under his breath. The approaching vehicle scared him off, and he disappeared into the storm. Amanda was found by the other trucker, half frozen and incoherent. She later learned that Ron's truck was discovered abandoned a few miles away, his CB radio still crackling with static. The notebook was gone. Authorities never found him. To this day, Amanda can't drive at night without glancing at the rearview mirror, haunted by the memory of those headlights, wondering if Ron is still out there, searching for his next live one. On the outskirts of a small Wyoming town, there's a stretch of road locals call the Devil's Mile. Not marked on any map, it's whispered about in truck stops and diners, a place where vehicles vanish, where the air feels heavier, and where even the most seasoned truckers avoid pulling over. Charlie wasn't one of those truckers. Charlie was a drifter with a chip on his shoulder, hauling freight to pay the bills and chasing the open road to escape memories he didn't care to revisit. On this particular night, he was heading west with a trailer full of produce and a delivery deadline he couldn't afford to miss. The radio warned of an approaching storm, but Charlie ignored it. He figured he'd outrun the weather like he always did. The first sign of trouble came just past midnight. Snow began to fall, light at first, then thick and blinding. His wipers struggled against the accumulating frost, the wind howling like a living thing outside the cab. His GPS glitched, the screen flickering before freezing entirely. With no other choice, Charlie relied on his instincts, steering the semi down the lonely highway. That's when he saw it. A figure standing in the road. Charlie slammed on the brakes, the trailer fishtailing dangerously as the truck skidded to a stop. Heart pounding, he leaned forward, squinting through the snow. A woman stood in the middle of the highway, barefoot and wearing a thin white dress that clung to her like it was soaked. Her hair was matted to her face, and her head hung at an unnatural angle. Jesus Christ, Charlie muttered, grabbing his flashlight. He stepped out of the cab, the cold hitting him like a slap. You okay, lady? What the hell are you doing out here? The woman didn't respond. She didn't move. Her arms hung limply at her sides, and her head seemed to tilt even further, as if gravity were slowly pulling it loose. Hey! Charlie barked, edging closer. The flashlight beam illuminated her face, pale, gaunt, her eyes wide and glassy. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. Just a dry, wheezing rasp that sent a chill racing down Charlie's spine. All right, I'm calling for help, he said, backing away toward the truck. Just stay there. But the moment he turned, she screamed. The sound was inhuman, high-pitched, guttural, like 1,000 voices shrieking at once. Charlie's instincts kicked in and he bolted back to the cab, slamming the door shut and locking it. His hands shook as he fumbled for his phone, but there was no signal. The radio was dead too, emitting only static. He glanced in the rearview mirror and froze. The woman was gone. Breathing heavily, Charlie gripped the wheel and shifted into gear. He told himself it was just some lunatic, maybe a runaway from a nearby town. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. Very wrong. As he drove, the snow intensified. The road seemed endless, the trees on either side closing in like a tunnel. His headlights barely pierced the swirling white, and the truck's tires struggled for traction. Then, out of nowhere, the woman reappeared. She was standing on the shoulder, her back to the road. As Charlie passed her, she turned her head to look at him. Just her head. Her body remained perfectly still. There, Charlie's stomach churned as he slammed the accelerator, desperate to put distance between them. But no matter how fast he went, she kept appearing. Sometimes ahead of him, sometimes in the mirrors, always watching. Her face grew closer, clearer, her empty eyes staring straight through him. Finally, he spotted a faint glow in the distance, a gas station. Relief flooded him as he pulled in, the truck hissing to a halt. The station was old, the kind with flickering neon signs and a single pump, but it was a beacon of hope in the storm. Charlie jumped out and ran inside. The clerk, an elderly man with a worn flannel shirt, looked up from his counter. "Rough night?" he asked. "You could say that," Charlie panted, leaning on the counter. "Some crazy woman out there. She keeps showing up. I think she's trying to mess with me." The clerk's expression darkened. He set down his coffee cup and crossed his arms. What'd she look like? Charlie described her. The dress, the hair, the way her head tilted. The clerk's face paled. "You need to leave," the clerk said, his voice low. "Now." "What? Why?" "That's not a woman. That's her." Before Charlie could ask who her was, the lights in the station flickered. The old man's eyes darted to the window. "Too late," he whispered. Charlie turned to see the woman standing in the lot, her bare feet sinking into the snow. The clerk grabbed a shotgun from under the counter and shoved it into Charlie's hands. "Take this. Don't stop. Don't look back. But go," the clerk shouted, pushing him out the door. Charlie stumbled back to his truck, his breath clouding the air. The woman was closer now, her mouth twisted into a ghastly grin. He climbed into the cab, the shotgun clattering onto the passenger seat, and floored the gas. The truck roared down the highway, but she was relentless. She appeared in front of the truck, then beside it, her face pressed against the driver's side window. Her eyes bore into his, and her grin widened impossibly, splitting her cheeks. The semi hit a patch of ice and slid, the trailer jackknifing. Charlie fought to regain control, the truck skidding dangerously close to the edge of a steep embankment. As he straightened out, the woman vanished. He drove until dawn, the snow finally easing as the sky turned a pale gray. When he reached the next town, he pulled into a diner, shaking and exhausted. Inside, he recounted his experience to a waitress, hoping for some kind of explanation. She listened, her face growing grim. "You've seen her," she said quietly. "They call her the Lady of the Mile. They say she was killed out there decades ago, hit by a truck. Now she haunts the road, luring drivers to their deaths." Charlie never drove that route again, but every time he passed a stretch of empty highway, he couldn't help but glance in the mirrors, half expecting to see her face staring back. On a fog-drenched night deep in the Appalachian Mountains, Robert, a long-haul trucker, found himself regretting the shortcut suggested by an old-timer at the truck stop. The man had assured him it would shave 2 hours off his route. But now, navigating the narrow, winding road with visibility reduced to a few feet, Robert wondered if he'd been pranked. The road was eerily quiet, bordered by dense, ancient forest. Even his usual companions, the crackling CB radio and the occasional chatter from fellow truckers, offered no solace. He hadn't passed another vehicle for miles, and the oppressive silence pressed on his nerves. Then he saw it. A flash of white on the side of the road. At first, Robert thought it was just a deer, but as his headlights swept over the figure, he realized it was a man. The stranger was tall, wearing a white suit, his back turned to the road. His arms hung limply by his sides, and he stood motionless as if carved from stone. Robert's instincts screamed at him to keep driving, but the unwritten code of the road forbade leaving someone stranded. He slowed the truck, rolling to a stop a few yards ahead of the man. Rolling down his window, Robert called out, "You all right, buddy? Need a lift?" The man didn't respond. He simply turned slowly to face the truck. Robert's breath caught. The man's face was pale, his features sharp, but his eyes were entirely black. Not dark brown, not shadowed, pitch black like polished obsidian. You okay?" Robert stammered. The man tilted his head, his lips curling into a smile that didn't reach those unnerving eyes. Before Robert could react, the figure started walking toward the cab. Each step seemed deliberate, unnaturally slow, as if time itself had slowed to accommodate him. "Hell no," Robert muttered, slamming the truck into gear. He floored the accelerator, leaving the figure in the swirling fog. His heart pounded as he checked the mirrors repeatedly, expecting the man to reappear. But the road remained empty. Breathing a sigh of relief, Robert chuckled nervously. Just some nutcase, he told himself. Then the CB crackled to life. Breaker, breaker, a voice said, low and raspy. You should have stopped. Robert froze. He hadn't touched the radio. The voice came again, louder this time. You should have stopped. Now you'll never leave. The hairs on the back of Robert's neck stood on end. He grabbed the microphone, his voice shaky. Who is this? Quit messing around. The radio went silent, but the truck shuddered violently, as if something massive had slammed into the trailer. Robert gripped the wheel, struggling to keep control. He glanced at the mirrors, but the fog was too thick to see anything. Another crash jolted the truck, this time on the passenger side. He could feel the weight of something pressing against the cab as though it were trying to climb in. Panic set in as the fog thickened further, swirling like a living thing around the truck. Suddenly, the road ahead changed. The asphalt disappeared, replaced by dirt and gravel. The trees seemed to close in, their gnarled branches clawing at the sky. Robert realized he was no longer on the same road. He couldn't have been. His GPS was dead, the screen blank, and his phone had no signal. Desperation clawed at him. He needed to get back to the highway, to find someone, anyone. But no matter how far he drove, the road only twisted deeper into the forest. The crashes against the truck grew more frequent, the impacts shaking the cab. He didn't dare stop, fearing whatever was out there would catch him if he did. Then he saw lights in the distance, flickering, like an old gas station. Relief flooded him as he pulled into the gravel lot, the truck screeching to a halt. The station was decrepit, its windows boarded up, but a faint glow emanated from inside. He leapt out of the cab, shouting for help. Hello? Anyone here? No answer. The only sound was the wind rustling through the trees. Robert approached the building cautiously, his boots crunching on the gravel. The air was thick with the scent of decay. As he reached the door, he noticed something scrawled across the glass in what looked like mud or blood. You can't leave! A cold dread washed over him. Spinning around, he bolted back to the truck, only to freeze in his tracks. The man in the white suit was standing by the driver's side door, his black eyes fixed on Robert. How'd you? Robert stammered, his voice faltering. The man grinned, wider this time, revealing teeth that were too sharp, too jagged to be human. He raised one hand and pointed at the trailer. Robert turned, his stomach dropping. The back doors of the trailer were open, swinging in the wind. He could see the darkness inside, pulsating like a living thing. You've brought it with you, the man whispered, his voice echoing unnaturally. Robert didn't wait to hear more. He ran, sprinting into the forest, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He didn't stop, even when the branches tore at his clothes, even when the eerie howls began to echo around him. No one knows what happened to Robert. His truck was found days later, parked neatly on the shoulder of an empty highway. The trailer was empty, its contents missing, but the words, "You can't leave," were scratched into the metal walls. Locals say the Devil's Mile claims another soul every year. And every year, another trucker learns the hard way that some shortcuts aren't worth taking. Late one stormy night, Sam, a trucker with a reputation for fearless night driving, was hauling a load through the dense forests of the Pacific Northwest. It was a route he had taken a dozen times before, winding through thick, towering trees that seemed to close in tighter as the rain poured harder. Tonight, though, the air carried a strange heaviness, an almost suffocating weight that pressed against him. As he drove, his headlights caught something ahead. At first, it looked like a deer standing in the middle of the road. But as he got closer, Sam realized it was a woman. She was drenched, her clothes sticking to her, her hair hanging limp over her face. She wasn't moving. Sam slowed the truck and rolled down his window just enough to call out, "Hey, you okay?" The woman didn't respond. Her head twitched slightly, but she didn't turn to face him. Cautiously, Sam pulled over to the shoulder, grabbing a flashlight before stepping into the rain. He approached her slowly, his boots splashing in the puddles. "Miss, do you need help?" Finally, she looked up. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and unblinking, and her lips moved, but no sound came out. Sam's gut twisted. Something about her wasn't right. Before he could say anything else, she bolted, running into the woods with a speed that didn't seem human. He stood frozen for a moment, the beam of his flashlight trembling as it followed her into the darkness. Against his better judgment, Sam called after her. "Wait! You'll freeze out here!" There was no answer. only the sound of rain pounding against the leaves. Sam returned to his truck, shaken but eager to move on. He chalked it up to a crazy encounter, maybe someone who'd wandered off from a nearby cabin. He wasn't about to get involved in something that wasn't his business. As he climbed into the cab, though, he noticed something chilling: wet footprints on the passenger seat. His eyes darted to the rearview mirror, and his blood turned to ice. The woman was sitting in the sleeper cab, her head tilted at an unnatural angle, staring at him through the gap in the curtain. Sam slammed on the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt. He twisted around, heart pounding, but the sleeper was empty. The curtain swayed slightly, as if someone had just brushed past it. Shaking, Sam grabbed the radio mic and called for help. "Breaker! Breaker! Anyone out there? I've got some crazy stuff going on in my rig." "I don't." The radio cut to static. Then a voice came through, distorted and barely audible. "You shouldn't have stopped." The hair on Sam's arm stood up. "Who is this?" The voice crackled again, laughing now, low and guttural. "She likes it when they stop." The truck suddenly lurched forward, though Sam hadn't touched the gas. The engine roared as if someone else were controlling it. Panicking, he tried to brake, but the pedal wouldn't budge. The truck barreled down the rain-soaked road, its headlights slicing through the storm, but it felt as if he was no longer the one in control. Through the windshield, Sam saw her again, standing in the middle of the road, drenched and still. He yanked the wheel to avoid her, the truck skidding wildly before coming to a violent stop in a ditch. Sam gasped for air, his hands gripping the wheel like a vice. Outside, the rain had stopped. The forest was silent, but then he heard it, a soft tapping on the driver's side window. He turned, dreading what he might see. The woman's face was pressed against the glass, her eyes black voids, her lips twisted into a grin too wide for her face, her hands smeared across the window, leaving streaks of mud or blood. Sam didn't think. He threw the door open on the passenger side and ran. He sprinted into the forest, branches slapping at his face, his breath coming in panicked gasps. He didn't look back, even when he heard the sound of wet footsteps behind him, following too close. He ran until his legs gave out, collapsing near a narrow creek. The rain started again, soaking him to the bone. He tried to catch his breath, his heart hammering against his ribs. That's when he felt it, a hand, cold and clammy, wrapping around his ankle. Sam screamed, kicking wildly, but there was nothing there. He scrambled to his feet and stumbled back toward the road, praying he'd find his truck. When he finally emerged from the trees, he found the highway deserted, his rig gone. Drenched, shivering, and terrified, Sam flagged down the first car he saw. The driver, an older man, listened to Sam's frantic story before his face turned pale. "You were on Black Hollow Road, weren't you?" the man asked. "Yeah, I think so," Sam replied. "Why?" The man hesitated, then said, "There's no cabin, no town nearby. That stretch of road, it's cursed. People say a woman died there years ago, a hitchhiker. She got hit by a truck and was left to die in the rain." Sam didn't respond. He couldn't. To this day, no one knows what happened to his truck. All they found was a patch of torn-up asphalt, deep gouges in the road, and muddy footprints leading into the woods. Sam quit driving shortly after that night, but sometimes when the rain falls hard enough, he swears he hears wet footsteps outside his window. Late one winter evening, Mike, a seasoned trucker hauling lumber across the Midwest, found himself behind schedule. The snowstorm that had been predicted came on faster and harder than expected, swallowing the road in a blinding flurry. His wipers struggled to keep the windshield clear, and the world beyond the headlights seemed to vanish into a wall of white. The CB radio had been silent for hours, save for the occasional crackle of static. Mike's only comfort was the soft hum of his engine and the faint glow of his dashboard. As he navigated the winding rural highway, he noticed a small weathered sign, Coldwater Hollow, 5 miles. Mike frowned. That town wasn't on his map, but he was running dangerously low on fuel. If Coldwater Hollow had a gas station, it was worth a stop. The turnoff was a narrow, tree-lined path, barely wide enough for his rig. The snow muffled the sound of his tires, and the trees arched overhead, their branches forming a skeletal tunnel. The further he drove, the darker it seemed to get, the headlights barely illuminating the road. Finally, he spotted the town, or what was left of it. Coldwater Hollow was a ghost town, its buildings leaning precariously under the weight of snow. There were no lights, no signs of life, only an eerie stillness. But in the center of the town, a dim glow caught his eye. It was a gas station. The pumps looked ancient, their metal rusted and bent, but one of them flickered faintly with light. Mike pulled up, his tires crunching over the frozen ground. He stepped out into the cold, his boots sinking into the snow. "Hello?" he called, his voice echoing off the empty buildings. There was no response. He tried the pump. To his surprise, it worked, the numbers ticking slowly as his tank filled. Relieved, Mike kept glancing over his shoulder, the weight of the silence pressing down on him. The town felt wrong, as if it were watching him. As he finished refueling, he heard it, a faint tapping. At first he thought it was the wind, but the sound was rhythmic, deliberate. It came from the direction of the truck. Mike froze. His breath fogged the air as he turned slowly. A figure stood at the edge of the light. A man, or what looked like a man. He was tall, his frame gaunt, his clothes tattered and soaked. His head hung at an unnatural angle and his eyes glinted with something otherworldly. "Need help?" Mike called, trying to mask the tremor in his voice. The figure didn't respond. Instead, it took a step closer, the tapping sound following. It wasn't until the figure reached the edge of the gas station's light that Mike realized what it was tapping, a long, rusted crowbar dragging against the pavement. Panic set in. Mike climbed back into his cab and locked the doors, his heart hammering. The figure stood still for a moment, then raised its head, revealing a face half covered in frostbite, the flesh blackened and peeling. It grinned, teeth yellow and jagged, then slammed the crowbar against the passenger window. Mike screamed, fumbling to start the engine. The truck roared to life just as the glass began to crack. He floored the accelerator, the rig lurching forward, sending snow spraying into the air. In the rearview mirror, the figure stood in the middle of the road, its grin never wavering. As he sped out of the town, Mike kept glancing at his mirrors, expecting to see the figure again. But the road remained empty. His breathing began to steady, and he allowed himself to believe he was safe, until the tapping started again. It was faint at first, then louder, coming from inside the cab. Mike's stomach churned as he glanced at the passenger seat. There it was. The crowbar rested on the seat, the metal slick with ice. The tapping grew louder, now coming from the sleeper cab behind him. Mike didn't dare look. He gripped the wheel tightly, muttering prayers under his breath. The noise grew louder and louder, pounding against his ears. And then it stopped. When Mike finally mustered the courage to glance in the rearview mirror, his blood ran cold. The figure was sitting in the sleeper cab, its frostbitten grin reflecting dimly in the mirror. Mike never completed that haul. His truck was found days later, abandoned on the side of a desolate road. The trailer was still loaded, and the cab was empty, except for one thing: a rusted crowbar resting neatly on the driver's seat. It was nearing midnight when Ben, a long-haul trucker, found himself on a desolate stretch of desert highway. The horizon was endless, swallowed in darkness, and the only sound was the low hum of his engine. His headlights illuminated the cracked asphalt ahead, but the world beyond was pitch black, the kind of dark that swallowed everything whole. Ben adjusted his seat and took another swig of lukewarm coffee. He had another 200 miles to cover before sunrise, and the monotony of the drive was already pulling at his eyelids. He fiddled with the CB radio, hoping for some chatter to break the silence, but all he got was static. Then, faintly, a voice crackled through. "Anyone out there? Anyone on this stretch?" The voice was male, shaky, and filled with dread. Ben grabbed the mic. "Yeah, I hear you. What's going on?" There was a pause. Then the voice came again, more urgent. "Whatever you do, don't stop. No matter what, just keep driving." Ben frowned. "What are you talking about? You okay out there?" The line went dead. The static returned, louder now, hissing in his ears. Ben tried switching channels, but the static persisted, almost drowning out the sound of his engine. A chill ran down his spine. He shook it off, muttering, "Just some nut messing around." The road stretched on, lifeless and empty, until it wasn't. Out of nowhere, a figure appeared in the distance, standing in the middle of the highway. Ben's heart jumped. He hit the brakes, the truck screeching to a halt just feet away from the person. It was a woman, her frame illuminated by his headlights. She was wearing a tattered white dress, her hair hanging in wet strands over her face. She didn't move, didn't flinch, even as the truck idled inches from her. Ben leaned out of the window. "Hey, are you okay? You shouldn't be out here." She didn't respond. Her head tilted slightly, her movements slow and jerky, like a puppet on strings. The air felt heavier, colder, as if the desert itself had gone still. "Lady, I don't have time for this," Ben muttered, easing the truck forward. He honked the horn, but she didn't budge. He swerved around her and picked up speed, his eyes fixed on the road ahead. But then, in the rearview mirror, he saw her again. She was standing in the middle of the road, her head now turned directly toward him. He couldn't see her face clearly, Manolith, but he could feel her stare, piercing and unrelenting. Ben's chest tightened. He pressed harder on the gas, the truck barreling forward. When he dared to glance in the mirror again, she was gone. The radio crackled to life. "You stopped, didn't you?" It was the same voice from before, trembling with fear. "I told you not to stop." "What the hell is going on?" Ben yelled into the mic. "She's marked you," the voice said. "She'll follow you now." Ben's grip on the wheel tightened. He didn't believe in ghosts, curses, or any of that nonsense, but something about the man's tone, about the woman, felt wrong. The road ahead seemed endless, the darkness pressing in closer. And then, without warning, she was there again. Standing at the edge of the headlights, her figure just barely visible. This time, she wasn't alone. Behind her, more figures began to emerge, one by one, their shapes flickering in and out of view, like static on an old TV. They were men, women, children, their faces twisted in expressions of anguish and rage. They lined the sides of the highway, staring at Ben's truck as it passed. "Hell no," Ben muttered, his knuckles white against the wheel. He sped up, refusing to stop, refusing to look too closely. But no matter how fast he drove, the figures kept pace, their movements unnatural, their limbs bending at impossible angles. The radio crackled again, louder this time. The voice screamed, "Get off the road! Get off now!" Ben veered onto an exit ramp without thinking, the truck shaking as it barreled down the uneven path. The figures vanished, the air seeming to lighten, but his relief was short-lived. The exit led him to a small rest stop, a single gas station with flickering lights and a rusted sign. He pulled into the lot, his hands trembling as he cut the engine. The silence was deafening. Ben stepped out, scanning the area. The station looked abandoned, the windows boarded up, the pumps long defunct. But he wasn't alone. She was there. The woman stood by the door of the station, her head tilted at that same unnatural angle. This time he could see her face, a hollow, gaping void where her eyes should have been. Her mouth stretched into a jagged smile, too wide for her face, and she wasn't smiling at him. She was smiling past him. Ben turned slowly, his stomach dropping. The figures were there again, surrounding the truck, their blank, dead eyes fixed on him. The radio in the cab crackled one last time. "I told you not to stop." Ben ran. He didn't care where he was going, he just knew he had to get away. The last thing he heard as he disappeared into the desert was the sound of laughter, high-pitched, broken laughter echoing in the night. Ben's truck was found days later, still parked at the abandoned rest stop. The driver's door was open, the keys in the ignition. There was no sign of Ben. But on the inside of the windshield, scratched into the glass, were 3 words: "Keep driving, always." It was a bitterly cold December night, and Jackson, a seasoned trucker, was hauling a shipment through the remote backroads of Wyoming. His GPS had stopped working hours ago, and the only thing guiding him was a series of faded road signs. The road stretched endlessly ahead, flanked by dense woods that loomed like shadowy sentinels in the moonlight. The snowstorm had started out light, but now it was a full-blown blizzard. Visibility was near zero, and Jackson had to squint just to keep the truck on the road. The CB radio offered no comfort, just static and occasional distorted whispers, as though the storm itself were trying to speak. As he approached a sharp bend in the road, he saw it. A car in the ditch, its hazard lights blinking weakly through the snow. Jackson slowed his rig to a stop, his headlights illuminating the scene. The car's driver's side door was open, but there was no one inside. Grabbing his flashlight, Jackson bundled up and stepped out of the cab. The wind howled, biting at his exposed skin as he trudged toward the car. "Hello?" he called out, his voice barely carrying over the storm. No response. Jackson's beam swept across the interior of the car. The driver's seat was empty, but the keys were still in the ignition, and the engine was idling weakly. On the dashboard was a half-eaten sandwich, and a child's stuffed bear lay on the passenger's seat. His gut tightened. Something was wrong. Jackson turned to scan the surrounding woods. "Hey, anyone out there?" he shouted. Then in the distance, he saw footprints in the snow leading into the trees. They were fresh and erratic, as though someone had been running. Against his better judgment, Jackson followed them. The beam of his flashlight danced over the snow, illuminating broken branches and disturbed underbrush. The forest was eerily quiet, the storm muffling all sound except the crunch of his boots. After about 100 yards, he found something that made his stomach churn. The footprints abruptly stopped in the middle of a clearing, as though the person had vanished into thin air. Jackson's breath fogged in the air as he spun in place, the hairs on the back of his neck standing on end. Then he heard it. A faint, high-pitched giggle. It came from behind him. Whipping around, he aimed his flashlight toward the sound, but there was nothing there, just trees and snow. The giggle came again, this time closer, and his heart began to race. "Who's out there?" he demanded, his voice shaking. A shadow darted between the trees, too fast for him to get a good look. It wasn't the shape of a person, though, too low to the ground, too fluid in its movement. Jackson began to backpedal, retracing his steps toward the truck. The snow was coming down harder now, the wind whipping through the trees, but he swore he could hear something following him. A soft, crunching sound, deliberate and measured. As he reached the edge of the woods, his flashlight flickered and died. Panic surged through him, and he stumbled, nearly falling into the ditch. When he finally made it back to his truck, he slammed the door shut and locked it, his hands trembling. He sat there for a moment, trying to catch his breath, when his headlights caught movement ahead. Standing in the middle of the road was a child, a little girl in a tattered white dress. Her hair was matted with snow, and she clutched a stuffed bear in one hand. Jackson rolled down his window slightly. "Hey, kid, are you okay? Where are your parents?" The girl didn't answer. She just stared at him, her eyes wide and unblinking. "Come on, I'll get you out of the cold," he said, reaching for the door handle. Then she smiled. Her teeth were sharp, jagged like broken glass, and her eyes turned black as coal. She dropped the bear, and it landed in the snow with a wet thud. From the woods, more figures began to emerge, shadows moving unnaturally, their limbs bent at impossible angles. Jackson didn't wait. He started the truck and floored the accelerator, the rig fishtailing on the icy road before gaining traction. In the rearview mirror, he saw the figures chasing him, their movements jerky and inhuman. The little girl stood motionless in the middle of the road, watching him go. The radio crackled to life. A voice, distorted and hollow, whispered, "You can't run forever." Jackson drove through the night, refusing to stop, even as exhaustion clawed at him. When dawn finally broke, he found himself on an unfamiliar stretch of highway, his fuel gauge dangerously low. He pulled into a truck stop, desperate for rest and a sense of normalcy. As he stepped out of the cab, he froze. There, sitting on the hood of his truck, was the stuffed bear, its button eyes staring blankly at him. Jackson quit trucking the next day. He never told anyone the full story, but he warned every driver he met, "If you see a car in the ditch on a snowy road, don't stop. Just keep driving." It was supposed to be an ordinary night shift for Caleb, a trucker delivering canned goods to a small town deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The route was familiar, narrow, winding roads cutting through dense forest, illuminated only by his truck's high beams. The radio was silent, his playlist looping the same country songs he'd grown tired of. Somewhere around midnight, his headlights flickered for a moment. Caleb cursed under his breath, slapping the dashboard. The lights steadied, but the brief darkness left him uneasy. There was something different about the road tonight, something heavier, quieter. Even the usual hum of insects and the rustle of leaves seemed absent. As he rounded a sharp curve, his headlights caught something in the distance. A figure stood in the middle of the road, waving their arms frantically. Caleb slowed the truck, squinting to get a better look. It was a man, disheveled and pale, his clothes torn and his face streaked with dirt. Caleb rolled down the window slightly. "You okay, buddy?" The man staggered closer, his eyes wide with terror. "You gotta turn back," he gasped, his voice trembling. "You can't go this way." "What are you talking about?" "This is the only road through," Caleb said, glancing at the GPS for confirmation. The man shook his head violently. "They'll take you. They'll—" His words cut off abruptly as he looked behind him, his face contorting in fear. "They're coming." Before Caleb could ask who they were, the man bolted into the woods, his movements frantic and desperate. Caleb leaned out of the cab, shining his flashlight into the trees, but the man had vanished. He debated for a moment whether to follow or call someone, but a gnawing instinct told him to leave. Shaking his head, he pulled the truck back onto the road and continued. "Crazy guy," he muttered, trying to convince himself it was nothing more than a bad encounter. Not 5 minutes later, the truck hit something, a loud thud under the wheels. Caleb slammed the brakes, his heart leaping into his throat. Grabbing his flashlight, he climbed out to see what he'd hit. The road was empty. Caleb crouched, shining the beam under the truck. There was no animal, no debris, nothing to explain the sound. But then, in the beam's edge, he saw something that made his skin crawl. Handprints. Dozens of muddy handprints smeared along the undercarriage, as if someone, or many someones, had been clinging to it. He scrambled back into the cab, locking the doors and flooring the accelerator. The truck roared down the road, its tires skidding slightly on the damp asphalt. Caleb's hands gripped the wheel tightly, his eyes darting to the mirrors. That's when he saw them. Figures, barely illuminated by the red glow of his taillights, running alongside the truck. They moved unnaturally, their limbs bending in ways that defied logic. Their faces were pale, almost luminous, with hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through the darkness. Caleb pressed harder on the gas, the truck groaning as it climbed a steep incline. The figures didn't fall back. If anything, they were gaining on him. One leaped onto the back of the trailer, its bony fingers clawing at the metal. The CB radio crackled to life. A distorted voice hissed through the static. "They're already inside." Caleb's stomach dropped. He glanced at the passenger seat. It was empty, at least at first glance. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw movement in the sleeper cab. His heart pounded as he caught a glimpse of something in the small mirror above the dashboard. A face, pale and grinning, its teeth sharp and yellow, its eyes wide with a manic, predatory gleam. Caleb swerved violently, the truck lurching as he tried to shake off whatever was clinging to it. The figure in the mirror disappeared, but the laughter started, low and guttural, echoing from the cab around him. The laughter was joined by whispers, unintelligible but growing louder, drowning out the sound of the engine. Caleb screamed, pounding on the steering wheel. "Get out of my truck!" he yelled, his voice breaking. Suddenly, the headlights illuminated a sign. "Dead Man's Hollow, next exit." The truck's engine sputtered and died, the cab shrouded in darkness. Caleb's momentum carried him forward, coasting to a stop just past the exit. He sat there, panting, his hands trembling on the wheel. The whispers stopped. For a moment, all was silent. Then, faintly, a knock came from the back of the trailer. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Caleb didn't move. His breath came in shallow gasps as he stared straight ahead, too afraid to look in the mirrors. The knocking came again, louder this time, and followed by a scraping sound, as if long nails were dragging across the metal. Summoning every ounce of courage, Caleb reached for his flashlight and opened the door. He climbed down, his boots crunching on the gravel. The trailer loomed behind him, its doors slightly ajar, swinging gently in the cold night wind. "Hello?" he called out, his voice trembling. The doors creaked open wider. The flashlight beam trembled as he aimed it into the trailer. It was empty. Caleb let out a shaky breath, relief flooding through him. He turned back toward the cab and froze. Standing by the truck was one of the figures, its hollow eyes fixed on him. Behind it, more emerged from the shadows, surrounding him in a silent, unholy circle. The last thing Caleb saw was their faces, twisted, inhuman, and grinning as they closed in. The truck was discovered days later, abandoned on the side of the road. The cab was locked, the engine dead, and the trailer still full of cargo. But etched into the frost on the driver's window was a single word: joined. It was past 2 a.m., and Lisa, a rookie long-haul trucker, was on her first solo cross-country run. Her route took her through an isolated stretch of the Nevada desert, a road infamous among truckers for its eerie reputation. They called it Route 13. Lisa didn't believe in ghost stories. She'd heard the tales, phantom hitchhikers, strange lights in the sky, voices on the wind, but she brushed them off as tired old myths to spook the newbies. Tonight, though, she found herself questioning her skepticism. The desert seemed alive, the air heavy with an unsettling silence, broken only by the steady drone of her engine. As she reached the midpoint of the road, her GPS suddenly cut out. The screen flickered before going dark entirely. Lisa frowned, smacking it in frustration. "Great," she muttered. Middle of nowhere, and now this thing craps out. The CB radio crackled to life. A voice, faint and distorted, murmured, "Stop! Please stop!" Lisa froze, her hand hovering over the wheel. The voice was garbled but desperate. She grabbed the mic. "Hello? Who's out there?" Silence. She repeated herself, but the radio stayed dead. Shaking her head, Lisa dismissed it as interference and pushed forward. The road stretched endlessly ahead, a thin ribbon cutting through the barren expanse. Her headlights illuminated nothing but asphalt and the occasional tumbleweed. Then she saw it, a figure on the side of the road. It was a man, standing perfectly still, his back to her. He wore an old-fashioned suit, tattered and dust-streaked, as if he'd stepped out of another century. His head was tilted down, and his hands hung limp at his sides. Lisa slowed the truck, her stomach knotting. She wasn't about to pick up a hitchhiker, not in the middle of nowhere, but something about the man's stillness unnerved her. As she passed him, she stole a glance in the side mirror. He was gone. Her foot slammed on the brake, and the truck skidded to a halt. Lisa's heart pounded as she leaned out the window, scanning the darkness. Nothing. The road was empty, the desert quiet. Just as she started to pull away, a loud bang came from the back of the trailer, like someone slamming their fists against the metal. Lisa jumped, her grip tightening on the wheel. Bang! 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 She climbed out of the cab, flashlight in hand. The freezing desert wind bit at her skin as she made her way to the back of the trailer. The banging had stopped, replaced by an oppressive silence. Lisa hesitated, then yanked the trailer doors open. The cargo was untouched. Shaking her head, she closed the doors and turned back toward the cab. That's when she saw them. Figures lined the side of the road, barely visible in the faint moonlight. They stood motionless, their shapes distorted and wrong, arms too long, necks craned at impossible angles. Lisa's flashlight flickered as she swept it across the scene, but the beam seemed to shy away from their faces, refusing to illuminate them. "Who's there?" she demanded, her voice cracking. The figures didn't move. They just stared, silent, unblinking. Lisa bolted for the cab, slamming the door behind her and locking it. She floored the accelerator, the truck roaring as it tore down the highway. The figures disappeared in the rearview mirror, swallowed by the darkness. She drove for what felt like hours, her knuckles white against the wheel. The road seemed to stretch endlessly, the same scenery repeating over and over like a looping nightmare. Her odometer hadn't moved, and she began to feel as though she were driving in circles. The CB radio crackled again. "Stop the truck. You're not supposed to be here." Lisa didn't answer. She turned the volume down, trying to drown out the rising panic in her chest. Then, the truck's headlights flickered and went out. The cab was plunged into darkness. Lisa's heart raced as she fumbled with the switches, trying to get the lights back on. When they finally came back, she gasped. The man in the tattered suit was standing in the middle of the road, directly in her path. His face was pale and lifeless, his mouth stretched into a grotesque grin. Lisa yanked the wheel to the side, the truck veering off the road. It skidded to a stop in the dirt, the engine sputtering. Her breathing was ragged as she glanced around, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The man was gone. Her phone buzzed suddenly, startling her. She pulled it out and saw a text message from an unknown number. "Turn around. Now." Before she could react, the passenger door creaked open. Lisa froze, her blood running cold. She hadn't unlocked it. Slowly, she turned her head. The man in the suit was sitting in the passenger seat, his hollow eyes fixed on her. His grin widened, revealing teeth blackened and broken. "You shouldn't have stopped," he whispered, his voice like the rustling of dry leaves. The last thing Lisa remembered was his laughter, low and guttural, echoing in her ears as the cab filled with darkness. The truck was found 3 days later, abandoned in the desert. The engine was dead, the doors locked. The cargo was untouched, but the cab was empty. On the windshield, scrawled in dust, were the words, "Don't stop."